November 10th, 1975. Lake Superior is in turmoil. Wind gusts near hurricane force batter the 729-foot freighter Edmund Fitzgerald. Captain Ernest McSorley radios the nearby Arthur M. Anderson. We are holding our own. Moments later, the Fitzgerald vanishes from radar. No distress call, no signal, just silence. Through the night, the Coast Guard searches in vain. All 29 men are gone, claimed by the lake that never gives up her dead. 50 years later, the question still echoes across the Great Lakes. What really happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald that night? This is the story of her final voyage and the mystery that still haunts the waters of Lake Superior. Join us as we commemorate the 50th anniversary of this Great Lakes tragedy. Welcome to the Shelldrake Files. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was born out of industry and ambition during the boom of Great Lakes shipping. Commissioned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company of Milwaukee as an investment in the iron ore trade, the ship was designed to be as large as possible to fit through the new St. Lawrence Seaway locks. Her keel was laid in August 1957 at the Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan. Just under a year later, on June 7, 1958, the Edmund Fitzgerald was christened and launched in a grand ceremony attended by more than 15,000 people. At 729 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 13,632 gross tons, she was the largest ship ever to sail the Great Lakes at the time of her launch, earning her the title Queen of the Lakes. The launch of the Fitzgerald was spectacular, but it didn't go entirely as planned. When Mr. Edmund Fitzgerald's wife Elizabeth swung the bottle to christen the ship, it infamously took 3 attempts to break, a misfortune sailors often consider a bad omen. Then, as the massive hull slid into the Detroit River, it sent a huge wave into the crowd and even struck a pier before righting itself. One man watching the launch was drenched by the icy water and reportedly suffered a fatal heart attack on the spot. These incidents led some to say that the Edmund Fitzgerald was cursed from the start. Superstition aside, the ship completed her sea trials in September 1958 and was soon earning her reputation as a Great Lakes workhorse. Named after Northwestern Mutual's president, Edmund Fitzgerald, the big freighter quickly became a favorite sight on the lakes. She was built not just for size, but also for speed and style. Her 7,500 horsepower turbine engine drove her at up to 16 miles per hour, fast for an ore carrier. And unlike many utilitarian freighters, the Fitzgerald boasted some luxurious touches: air-conditioned crew quarters, tiled bathrooms, carpeted lounges, and even 2 passenger staterooms. These comforts earned her nicknames like Cadillac of the Great Lakes. But her primary job was hauling taconite iron ore pellets from mines near Duluth, Minnesota to steel mills around the Great Lakes. In this role, she was a record setter. The Fitzgerald carried more tonnage than any other laker of her era, repeatedly breaking seasonal haul records during her 17 years of service. 6 times she set a new record for the most ore carried in a season, a testament to her massive capacity and the skill of her crew. The Edmund Fitzgerald developed a bit of legend in her life, not just in her loss. Ship watchers along the Sioux Locks and the Detroit River grew fond of her frequent appearances. Captain Peter Pulser, one of her early masters, was known for entertaining onlookers by piping music over the ship's intercom as she passed through locks, and providing commentary over his PA system for spectators on shore. The Fitzgerald's size and Captain Pulser's showmanship made her a celebrity on the lakes, earning affectionate nicknames like Big Fitz and the Pride of the American Side. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, The Fitzgerald enjoyed a successful career with no major incidents. She did undergo some upgrades, notably converting from coal-fired boilers to fuel oil in 1971, and remained one of the most modern ships on the lakes. By 1975, she was under the command of Captain Ernest M. McSorley, a veteran mariner with decades of experience. At 63 years old, McSorley had a reputation as a heavy weather captain, unafraid of rough seas. Little did anyone know that in the fall of 1975, the Fitzgerald was about to face the worst storm of her life. November 9, 1975. The Edmund Fitzgerald was loading cargo at Burlington Northern Dock No. 1 in Superior, Wisconsin. She took on about 26,000 long tons of taconite pellets, bound for a steel mill near Detroit. Despite it being November, notorious for fierce storms on the Great Lakes, Captain McSorley cast off that afternoon around 2:15 p.m. Another ore freighter, the SS Arthur M. Anderson, departed Two Harbors, Minnesota the same day, and by evening the Anderson had caught up to sail about 10 miles or so behind the faster Fitzgerald. The two ships maintained radio contact and, aware of a developing storm, agreed on a northerly route across Lake Superior for shelter. Instead of the usual direct route, they hugged the Canadian shore to seek protection from highlands on that side of the lake. This course took them north of Isle Royale along the Ontario coast, a longer path, but one that could offer some relief from the coming gale. By late on November 9th, the National Weather Service had upgraded gale warnings to a full storm warning for Lake Superior. A deep low-pressure system was moving in, the classic November witch brewing over the Great Lakes. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. In the early hours of November 10, 1975, the Fitzgerald and the Anderson were laboring through winds gusting 50 to 60 knots and seas of 12 to 16 feet, with snow squalls cutting visibility. Captain McSorley and Captain Bernie Cooper of the Anderson stayed in contact, comparing notes on the weather and adjusting their plans. McSorley, normally a hard driver, actually reduced speed to let the Anderson close the gap, indicating just how rough the conditions were becoming. Mid-afternoon on November 10th, the storm was unleashing its full fury over eastern Lake Superior. Around 3:30 p.m., McSorley radioed that the Edmund Fitzgerald was in trouble. "Anderson, this is Fitzgerald. I have a bad list, lost both radars, and am taking heavy seas over the deck, one of the worst seas I've ever been in." The Fitzgerald had taken water heavy enough to damage 2 vent covers and a fence railing along the deck, and she was listing badly to one side. 2 of her 6 bilge pumps ran continuously to try to clear water that was coming on board. With both radars knocked out, McSorley was effectively blind in the blizzard-like snow. He asked the Anderson to stay close and provide radar guidance. Captain Cooper on the Anderson agreed, and both vessels throttled back, with the Anderson now essentially leading the way, keeping the Fitzgerald advised of navigational marks. The nearest refuge was Whitefish Bay, at the southeastern end of Lake Superior, where the ships would naturally find calmer waters. Whitefish Bay lay about 20 more miles ahead of the Fitzgerald by late afternoon. However, another setback came when McSorley learned that Whitefish Point's light and radio beacon, critical navigational aids near the bay's entrance, were not operational, possibly knocked out by the storm's fury or a power failure on shore. The Fitzgerald called the Coast Guard station at Grand Marais, Michigan about 4:30 p.m. to ask about the lighthouse and beacon. The reply was that both were down. This meant entering Whitefish Bay in zero visibility would be even more dangerous. McSorley radioed any nearby vessels for help, and a small Coast Guard cutter, Naugatuck, responded that it would check on the light. Another ship, a Swedish vessel named Avafors, reported back about 5 p.m. that the Whitefish Point light was indeed on, but the radio beacon remained out. Upon hearing this, McSorley was also overheard telling a crewman, "Don't allow nobody on deck." All afternoon and into early evening, the Anderson kept the Fitzgerald informed of her position relative to Whitefish Bay. The two ships were roughly paralleling each other about 10 miles apart in the blinding snow. The Fitzgerald, without radar, had to trust the Anderson's reports. Despite the Fitzgerald's earlier difficulties, Captain McSorley sounded optimistic that if they could just reach the shelter of Whitefish Bay, they'd be all right. The Anderson trailed a short distance behind, occasionally catching glimpses of the Fitzgerald on radar or visually when visibility momentarily improved. They could tell the Fitzgerald was still there, battling onward. 7:10 p.m., November 10th. The Arthur M. Anderson made radio contact one last time. First Mate Morgan Clark on the Anderson asked how the Fitzgerald was doing. McSorley's voice came back. "We are holding our own." There was no alarm in his tone, just the strain of a long day of fighting the storm. For a moment, the snow lifted enough that the Anderson's radar picked up a vessel ahead about 10 miles, presumably the Fitzgerald, but then that blip disappeared from the screen. Within minutes of the holding our own transmission, the Edmund Fitzgerald vanished. The Anderson could neither raise the Fitzgerald by radio nor see her on radar. Captain Cooper and his crew knew something was very wrong. At approximately 7:25 p.m., after repeated unanswered calls, Cooper contacted the U.S. Coast Guard to report, "I am very concerned about the welfare of the steamer Edmund Fitzgerald. She may have capsized." Thus began a desperate search and rescue operation under nightmarish conditions. The Coast Guard station at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan received Cooper's call at 7:39 p.m. Initial response was hampered by the storm. Communication antennas were damaged by the wind, and the Coast Guard, who was already dealing with a distress call about a small 16-foot boat lost in the same storm. The officer on duty did not immediately grasp that a 729-foot freighter might have just gone down. He even asked Captain Cooper to switch radio channels to keep the emergency channel clear. Frustrated and alarmed, Cooper persisted. By 9:03 p.m., he finally convinced the Coast Guard that the Edmund Fitzgerald was missing and likely sunk. With no Coast Guard cutters immediately available on Lake Superior, the initial search had to rely on other commercial vessels and aircraft. The Coast Guard urgently requested the Arthur M. Anderson to turn around in the still raging storm to look for survivors. Captain Cooper, displaying tremendous courage, complied, even though it meant steering his own ship back into the worst of the seas that had just claimed the Fitzgerald. Another large freighter, the SS William Clay Ford, departed shelter in Whitefish Bay to assist in the search as well. A third vessel, the Hilda Marjan, attempted to join but was forced to retreat by the monstrous waves. Through the night, the Anderson and the Ford plowed through the darkness, shining searchlights and trying to find any sign of the Fitzgerald or its lifeboats. Around 10:53 p.m., a Coast Guard HU-16 fixed-wing search aircraft arrived, braving the turbulent skies. Shortly after midnight, a Coast Guard helicopter from Traverse City, equipped with a powerful searchlight, also reached the area and began combing the white-capped waves. Canadian Coast Guard aircraft joined the effort as well by the next morning, and authorities in Ontario organized shoreline patrols, watching for any wreckage washing up. The following day, November 11th, 1975, the awful truth became clear. All that was found were fragments, 2 battered lifeboats, some inflatable rafts, and debris from the ship. Tragically, none of the 29 crewmen were ever found. Not a single body surfaced in the aftermath, likely due to Lake Superior's frigid temperatures, which inhibit decomposition and keep the lost crew at the bottom. After 3 days of searching over hundreds of square miles, the Coast Guard declared that the Edmund Fitzgerald and her entire crew were lost. The Anderson's captain somberly reported, "No survivors." The Big Fitz had gone down so quickly that no one had time to don life jackets or radio a mayday. The focus then shifted from rescue to locating the wreck. On November 14th, just 4 days after the sinking, the U.S. Navy dispatched a plane with specialized detection equipment. A Navy P-3 Orion aircraft flying low over the last known position picked up a strong magnetic anomaly on the lake bed, likely the Fitzgerald's massive steel hull. Using side-scan sonar, the Coast Guard confirmed the find later that day. 530 feet below the surface were two large objects lying close together on the bottom of Lake Superior. The Fitzgerald had indeed broken in two. Over the next few weeks, additional sonar survey work mapped the wreck site. Then in May 1976, a U.S. Navy team sent down the unmanned submersible Curve 3 with a camera. The remote vehicle provided the first images of the Edmund Fitzgerald's remains. The ship had split into two major sections, the bow upright in the mud, and the stern flipped upside down about 170 feet away, with the debris field of taconite pellets strewn between them. The hull appeared twisted and torn, but largely in recognizable pieces. This indicated the possibility that the ship might have broken apart either at the surface or upon impact with the bottom, a subject of much debate, as we'll see in just a bit. Several manned and unmanned expeditions over the years continued to survey the wreck. Famed ocean explorer Jean-Michel Cousteau led the first manned submersible dive to the Fitzgerald in 1980, capturing eerie footage of the ghostly wreck, but reaching no firm conclusion on the exact cause. In 1989, an extensive survey with a tethered robot submersible produced a detailed video and sonar mosaic of the site. These efforts, along with later dives in the 1990s, not only helped investigators piece together the Fitzgerald's final moments, but also spurred important decisions about preserving the site. The wreck lies in Canadian waters, and the province of Ontario eventually declared it an official protected marine heritage site, essentially a grave site off limits to disturbance. The families of the Fitzgerald's crew have always maintained that the shipwreck is a final resting place that should remain untouched. With the site located and surveyed, attention then turned to the mystery. What caused a seasoned crew and a massive ship to vanish so suddenly on a lake they had traversed many times before? To this day, no one can say with absolute certainty what sequence of events sent the Fitzgerald to the bottom in mere seconds. However, experts generally agree on three leading theories from official inquiries and accounts from other ships. All of these theories involve the extreme weather the Fitzgerald encountered, but they differ on the precise failure that doomed the ship. Let's examine each one. One widely supported theory is that the Edmund Fitzgerald was swamped by one or more enormous waves, often referred to as rogue waves. Lake Superior mariners speak of the Three Sisters phenomenon, a series of three rogue waves larger than the rest coming in succession. The idea is that the first wave hits and floods the deck with water that can't fully drain before the next wave strikes, and then a third wave adds even more, creating a sudden and catastrophic flooding. There is compelling evidence that such waves hit the Arthur M. Anderson that same night. Captain Cooper of the Anderson reported that about 6:30 p.m., roughly 40 minutes before the Fitzgerald sank, his ship was struck by two huge waves, each 30 to 35 feet high, large enough to roll over his deck and damage a lifeboat. Cooper watched these towering walls of water continue moving in the direction of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which was some miles ahead of him in the storm. He later testified that perhaps a third massive wave followed, and that these three sisters likely engulfed the Fitzgerald around 7:15 p.m. If true, the Fitzgerald, already low in the water from heavy cargo and riding with a slight list, could have been pushed under by the sheer weight of water on her decks. Modern simulations lend credence to this scenario. In 2005, NOAA researchers ran a computer model of the November 10, 1975 storm. They found that in the area where the Fitzgerald went down, the significant wave heights would have been on the order of 25 feet, with some waves up to 36 feet and a few even approaching 45 to 50 feet tall. Winds were likely sustained near 70 miles an hour, with gusts to 86 miles per hour. These conditions could indeed generate freak waves of the size Captain Cooper described. One study using wave tank experiments showed that a 56-foot rogue wave could have temporarily submerged the Fitzgerald's bow or stern completely. Lake Superior, although enclosed, is notorious for short, steep wave patterns that can catch even experienced sailors off guard. Proponents of the rogue wave theory believe that the Fitzgerald might have plunged headfirst into an unusually large wave or series of waves, driving the bow under. This could have flooded her cargo hold or forced the ship into a nosedive from which she couldn't recover. Another possibility is that the Fitzgerald broke apart on the surface due to the stress of these waves. Notably, many of the 29 crew had reported the Fitzgerald bending in heavy seas during previous voyages. It was said you could feel the hull flex, an unsettling trait in some long-oar carriers. The ship was constructed with an all-welded hull, which, unlike older riveted ships, has less give under strain. Combined with the Edmund Fitzgerald's massive length, this meant huge stresses in storm conditions. The evidence from the wreck site fuels this idea. When the wreck was first photographed in 1976, the bow and the stern were initially reported to lie fairly close together, suggesting the ship might have split as it hit the bottom. But a later 1994 survey by researcher Terry D. Shannon found the two main sections 255 feet apart, with indications the stern had rotated and spilled its cargo as it sank. This led some experts, like historian Frederick Stonehouse, to conclude that the Edmund Fitzgerald likely suffered a structural breakup at the surface before plunging to the bottom. The fact that the ship's taconite cargo is spread out in a wide debris field, and that the stern landed inverted, hints that the Fitzgerald may have broken in two above the lake bed, possibly as a result of extreme wave stress. The sinking of two similar Great Lakes freighters in the 1950s, the SS Carl D. Bradley and SS Daniel J. Morrell, were known to involve breaking in half on the surface due to wave action, lending historical precedent. To sum up, Theory 1 holds that nature itself dealt the fatal blow. One or more giant waves, in combination with the already vicious storm conditions, overwhelmed the Fitzgerald, either swamping her and causing a sudden loss of stability, or actually breaking her hull from extreme stress. This theory aligns with the last radio message. No mayday was sent, likely because the end came within seconds, as a massive surge of water sent the ship to the bottom before the crew could react. It's a scenario of being, quite literally, sunk by the wrath of Lake Superior. Another leading explanation is that the Edmund Fitzgerald flooded gradually through her cargo hatches until she lost buoyancy, and then suddenly plunged to the bottom. This was the conclusion of the official U.S. Coast Guard investigation in 1977. The Coast Guard's Marine Casualty Report pointed to ineffective hatch closures on the Fitzgerald's deck as the culprit. The ship had 21 large cargo hatches on her deck, which were covered by massive steel hatch covers and secured by clamps. These covers were supposed to be watertight. However, it was common practice on Great Lakes freighters to not fasten every clamp on every hatch for a short voyage, especially if the lake was initially calm. Crews often secured only some clamps and would tighten the rest as needed if weather worsened. The Coast Guard suspected that on the Fitzgerald's final voyage, not all hatch clamps were fully secured, and as the seas built higher, waves began to slowly spill into cargo holds through the gaps around the hatch covers. Over a period of hours, water could have been accumulating in the hold, unbeknownst to the crew, until finally the ship was fatally low in the water. Supporting this theory, when the wreck was surveyed, divers found many of the hatch clamps on the Fitzgerald were unbroken and in the open and unfastened position, indicating they hadn't been dogged down tightly. For instance, on hatch number 5, 14 out of 16 clamps were undamaged and open, suggesting that they were never secured. The Coast Guard reports surmise that only a few clamps per hatch might have been fastened, and those few failed under the strain, allowing water to pour into the holds. With each big wave, more water shipped on board and leaked below, gradually sinking the ship lower until finally resulting in a fatal loss of buoyancy and stability, as the report said. In this scenario, the crew might not realize the extent of flooding until it was too late, and the Fitzgerald could have suddenly plummeted without time for a distress call, consistent with what happened. However, the leaky hatch theory has its critics. Many Great Lakes captains and the Lake Carriers Association disputed the idea that hatch clamps were to blame. They noted that the one-piece steel hatch covers used on the Fitzgerald were a modern design considered far stronger than older types, and no Laker had ever been lost due to their failure in 40 years of use. It was also common knowledge that not all clamps would be dogged in good weather. Captains argued they routinely sailed with minimal clamps and had never experienced major leaks. One experienced captain, Paul Trimble, wrote to the NTSB saying the Coast Guard's finding was unwarranted and that the industry viewed the hatch covers as very reliable. Captain Cooper of the Anderson and others were skeptical that a crew as seasoned as McSorley's would have negligently left the ship in jeopardy by failing to secure hatches in a storm. The National Transportation Safety Board conducted its own investigation and in 1978 offered a slightly different twist. They agreed water likely caused the sinking, but proposed it happened more suddenly. The NTSB's analysis of wreck footage noted specific damage to the front of the ship. Hatch cover number 1 was found collapsed into the cargo hold and buckled. Hatch number 2 was completely missing, and other hatch combings were deformed as if by great force. This suggested that massive boarding waves might have collapsed one or more hatch covers outright, dumping a tremendous volume of water into the hold in an instant. If, for example, a giant wave or series of waves slammed down on the Fitzgerald, it could have caved in a hatch cover that wasn't designed to withstand such weight. The NTSB concluded that the likely cause was the collapse of one or more hatch covers under the weight of giant boarding seas, which would have flooded the hold so fast the ship sank abruptly. In other words, whereas the Coast Guard saw a slow, progressive flooding through unsecured hatches, the NTSB leaned toward a catastrophic structural failure of the hatch covers due to the storm. Either way, both the Coast Guard and the NTSB agree that water got into the cargo hold and caused the Edmund Fitzgerald to lose stability. Whether it leaked slowly through improperly secured hatch clamps or crashed in suddenly by collapsing a hatch, the end result was the same. The iron ore cargo would have shifted or been buoyed by water. The ship's bow or stern dipped, and within moments the freighter plummeted to the bottom without warning. This theory helps explain why McSorley gave no distress signal. If he thought they were holding our own even minutes before, he likely did not realize how much water was inside. The ship could have been on the very verge of capsizing or sinking while those on the bridge still believed they could ride out the storm. Today, many blend this theory with the rogue wave idea. For instance, perhaps not all clamps were set and a pair of huge waves swamped the deck, simultaneously wrenching a hatch cover loose and sending torrents below. In fact, the official Coast Guard report was updated to acknowledge the possibility of sudden massive flooding as an alternative to the slow leak scenario. Importantly, as a result of the Fitzgerald investigation, shipping regulations were changed to require improved hatch cover inspections, mandatory use of all clamps, and even heightening the freeboard on Great Lakes vessels. In other words, they took no chances. The Fitzgerald taught that even a theoretical risk with hatch covers had to be addressed. The third major theory posits that the Edmund Fitzgerald grounded on a hidden shoal or reef during the storm, suffering damage that led to her sinking. Essentially, This theory says the Fitzgerald may have unknowingly scraped the bottom of the lake at some point on November 10th, opening her hull to flooding. The most prominent version of this idea centers on a place called 6 Fathom Shoal near Caribou Island in northeastern Lake Superior. This rocky shoal rises sharply from deeper water, and crucially, it lies not far from the course the Fitzgerald took that evening. Here's how the shoaling theory developed. The Lake Carriers Association, representing the shipping companies, argued that the real cause was not hatch covers or waves, but a navigational nightmare. They pointed out that during the height of the storm, the Whitefish Point light and radio beacon were out, meaning the Fitzgerald and the Anderson might have been off their intended course. After the sinking, a 1976 Canadian hydrographic survey revealed an undiscovered ridge of high ground that extended about a mile further east than charts showed, in the area of 6 Fathom Shoal. If the Fitzgerald veered even slightly off course in the poor visibility, she could have belly slammed onto this rocky shoal. With a depth of roughly 36 feet and the Fitzgerald's draft about 27 feet, striking such a reef in heavy seas could have been devastating. Crewmen on the Arthur M. Anderson did note that the Fitzgerald appeared to sail right over the area of 6 Fathom Shoal on their radar around 4:30 or 5 p.m. Captain Cooper later recalled that he lost the Fitzgerald's radar signal in that area, perhaps when she was in the trough of a wave near the shoal. Supporters of this theory suggest that the Fitzgerald might have grounded briefly or hit a spur, damaging her keel and hull bottom. The downed fence railing McSorley reported at 3:30 p.m., which was a rail along the deck, could, in this theory, be evidence of hull hogging if the bow and stern lifted on a shoal. Essentially, hitting the reef could have wrenched the hull so violently that it snapped a support cable, which is why the railing was found ripped away. If her bottom was torn or punctured by rocks, water could flood in from below, gradually or suddenly. Then, hours later, perhaps when those rogue waves struck, the weakened ship broke apart and sank. Is there proof of grounding? The case is circumstantial. A dive to 6 Fathom Shoal after the wreck found no obvious fresh scrape marks or gouges on the rocks that could be definitively linked to a ship hull. And when submersibles examined the Fitzgerald's wreck, the damage was chaotic but not a clear smoking gun for a rock strike, though the ship's center section was in pieces, which some interpret as consistent with a breakup from shoaling. Detractors of the shoal theory note that the Fitzgerald almost made it to Whitefish Bay. If she'd been fatally ripped open at 5 p.m., could she have stayed afloat for 2 more hours? It's possible, if only a small portion of the hull was opened. The pumps might have kept up for a while, but not certain. The Lake Carriers Association, however, had strong motivation to promote this theory. If an uncharted shoal was responsible, it would imply the crew and company were not at fault, that it was a tragic accident of nature and bad charts. Some pointed out that the Lake Carriers Association stance conveniently absolved the shipping industry and Coast Guard of blame. Nevertheless, the shoaling idea remains plausible and has its supporters. To sum up, the grounding theories argue that the Edmund Fitzgerald's final wounds came from below. The ship bottomed out on a rocky shoal, unbeknownst to the crew, and that damage led to her sinking hours later. It might explain the suddenness and why the crew didn't issue a mayday. While no consensus exists, each official investigation acknowledged shoaling as a possibility. The NTSB, for example, had a dissenting opinion in 1978 that the Fitzgerald did shoal and sink unexpectedly as a result. To this day, many books and experts debate between waves, hatch covers, or shoals, or a combination of all three, as the cause of the Fitzgerald's demise. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald gripped the public's imagination like no other Great Lakes shipwreck. The very name Edmund Fitzgerald became synonymous with the power of the lakes and the bravery of those who work on them. Over the past 50 years, This ship and her crew have been honored in song, memorial services, museum exhibits, and maritime safety improvements. As we approach the half-century mark of her sinking, the legacy of the Edmund Fitzgerald looms larger than ever. Perhaps the most famous memorial came just a year after her sinking. Canadian singer-songwriter Gordon Lightfoot released The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1976, immortalizing the event in popular culture. Lightfoot's song told the story of November 10, 1975 to millions who might never have heard of the ship otherwise. It famously includes the line, "The church bell chimed till it rang 29 times for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald," referring to a real incident at Detroit's Mariners Church. In fact, on the morning after the sinking, Reverend Richard Ingalls of Mariners Church did ring the bell 29 times in honor of the lost crew. That act began a tradition. Every year since 1975, on or about November 10th, Mariners Church of Detroit holds a memorial service where the bell is rang 29 times for the Fitzgerald's men. These services have continued for decades, drawing hundreds of people each year. They have evolved to honor all sailors lost on the Great Lakes, but the Edmund Fitzgerald's crew remains the centerpiece. Dignitaries, family members, and Great Lakes mariners gather to hear the names of the 29 read aloud, each followed by the solemn clang of the church's bell echoing once for every soul. Far to the north, near the scene of the disaster, another bell serves as a memorial. In 1995, on the 20th anniversary of the sinking, the Edmund Fitzgerald's actual bell was recovered from the wreck on the lake bottom. A joint Canadian-American expedition led by explorer Dr. Joseph McInnes and supported by the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society and the Canadian Navy carefully raised the 200-pound bronze bell from the Fitzgerald's pilot house. As the bell broke the surface on July 4, 1995, its clapper gently rang for the first time in 20 years, a touching moment captured on film. The reason for recovering the bell was to establish a permanent memorial. The original bell, which once rang to signal the ship's presence, would now ring to honor her crew. After conservation, the bell was placed on display at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, Michigan, 17 miles from where the Fitzgerald sank. Engraved on the bell's rim are the names of all 29 crew members. To replace it on the wreck, divers left a replica bell inscribed with the words Edmund Fitzgerald and November 10, 1975. Each year on the anniversary, the museum holds a ceremony at the Whitefish Point Lighthouse and rings the Fitzgerald's bell 29 times, with a 30th toll added in recent years to honor all lives lost on the Great Lakes. These gatherings, especially on milestone anniversaries, are intimate and impressive, often attended by the surviving family members of the Fitzgerald's crew. This year, the 50th anniversary memorial at Whitefish Point is expected to be a significant event, with a private family service in the evening. The museum even plans to live stream the event so that people around the world can join in remembering the men of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Beyond the bell tributes, there are other memorials and influences. The Maritime Sailors Cathedral mentioned in Gordon Lightfoot's song is indeed Mariners Church in Detroit, which has a plaque and display commemorating the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Dawson Great Lakes Museum in Detroit and the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Michigan's Upper Peninsula both feature Edmund Fitzgerald exhibits, including artifacts and video footage of the wreck. A section of one of the Fitzgerald's cracked lifeboats, for example, is on display at the museum ship Valley Camp in Sault Ste. Marie. In the Fitzgerald's former home port of Milwaukee and her launch site near Detroit, historical markers note her place in Great Lakes lore. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Edmund Fitzgerald is the impact on Great Lakes shipping safety. The tragedy prompted a thorough review of maritime regulations. In the years following 1975, authorities implemented tougher weather monitoring and communication protocols for ships. required vessels to have depth finders and bottom-sounding equipment, mandated the use of survival suits for crews on lake freighters, and increased the required freeboard on newer ships. The sinking directly influenced the U.S. and Canadian Coast Guards to improve their search and rescue response capabilities on the Great Lakes. For instance, having helicopters on standby in bad weather and better coordinating multi-ship search efforts. In that sense, the lives lost on the Fitzgerald were not entirely in vain. Maritime practices were changed to reduce the chances of another such disaster. As we mark 50 years since her last voyage, the legend of the Edmund Fitzgerald, as Gordon Lightfoot sang, truly lives on. Each November, when the gales howl outside and the skies turn gray, people around the Great Lakes remember Captain McSorley's steadfast courage and the 28 men who sailed with him into history. Schools teach the story to new generations. Divers and historians continue to study the wreck, and communities from Duluth to Detroit hold memorial events. Throughout the summer of 2025, a relay team of endurance swimmers even carried a memorial baton 411 miles from Lake Superior to Detroit in honor of the Fitzgerald's 50th anniversary, a remarkable tribute linking the waters the Fitzgerald herself once traversed. Ultimately, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald has become much more than a lost ship at the bottom of Lake Superior. It's a legend, a story of nature's fury, of brave souls on treacherous seas, of unanswered questions, and of remembrance. It reminds us that the Great Lakes, for all their beauty, are capable of immense destruction, and that even the largest, most advanced ship can meet with disaster given a cruel twist of fate. Standing at Whitefish Point on a calm sunny day, it's hard to imagine the waves towering like buildings and winds roaring like freight trains, but the Fitzgerald story shows that we never underestimate the gales of November again. As we conclude this story, we honor those 29 men who lost their lives on November 10, 1975. Their names are etched in plaques, engraved on the memorial bell, and memorialized in song and story. 50 years on, the Edmund Fitzgerald sails on in our collective memory, a lasting beacon of the importance of safety, respect for nature's power, and the human desire to remember and make meaning of tragedy. To the crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald, may you forever rest in peace. Every November 10th, across the Great Lakes, we will continue to ring the bell and tell your story, so that the legend of the Edmund Fitzgerald will never be forgotten.